to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fawcett. Each week we interview experts in AI, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. In our show today, we look at decision intelligence and AI. I'm joined by Anand, Thaker, strategic go-to-market and operating advisor, and a player in residence for the CRM players. And how I met you, Anand, was, of course, through our buddies, the CRM players. But welcome.
Right. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to have a conversation. We've always had plenty offline, and now we're about to jump into something that we both really appreciate in terms of what the future of business is going to be like. So,
yeah, it's exciting. This is one of my favorite topics, to be honest, and I've written a bunch about it over the last year or so because I've seen such a shift with the whole addition of AI. So, just for the audience, can you do a quick introduction, and then let's just talk a little bit about your experience with decision intelligence and AI, and how you've kind of gotten to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had an eclectic background, but currently I'm serving as I'm on a semi-sabbatical, but I'm currently advising venture firms and private equity firms, and then of course go-to-market executives and analysts, and occasionally the occasional technology company that's kind of trying to navigate their roadmaps and where they're moving forward. But I've been an investor, advisor, and a builder, former serial entrepreneur. We'll say they say that no one really is a former serial entrepreneur, so we'll see how that holds out. But I've been involved in the energy, finance, and healthcare space. But of course, most of my work has been in the go-to-market arena, particularly sales, CRM, marketing, CX, and customer service. And then, of course, investing in those particular areas. So worked with a range of companies, both startup large styles, sizes, as well as the financial institutions and even universities and governments in my past. So I've always appreciated learning behaviors and influences of other people, and then trying to find ways to apply, finding opportunities in them. So obviously this is very natural for decision intelligence as we, as we dive into that. Yeah.
Well, so just to get us started, because I use this term all the time, decision intelligence, but I'm sure the audience doesn't necessarily know what I'm talking about. So could you give us kind of a basic definition for those that aren't really familiar with the term decision intelligence?
Yeah, so I'm going to oversimplify it, and then we can dive in a little bit more. But traditionally, decision intelligence, which formerly was decision support for those that are been around for long enough, is really about the idea of trying to using methodical, analytical means of being able to make better decisions. And I've split it into two. I know everybody's got a different definition about this. And partly there is the study and the analysis of decisions, both individually and as a collective, and then application of that. And that's where the AI piece comes into play. So the irony is that decision intelligence isn't AI based. It's actually offline human beings trying to figure out how to sort out, taking data analysis experiences and then formulating a methodical and systematic process and coupled with their judgment to improve their decision-making skills. And so, AI, and we'll get into this course, is going to certainly increase that and accelerate that in many ways. When we were in decision support, the reason there was some real big leap in that category was because we had access to being able to programmatically do that. And then we also had lots of data. That was the next wave that occurred. So when we were talking about data is everything and everywhere and it's oil, it certainly improved our ability to, collect feedback on that information and then try to make better decisions. And now this next wave, as you and I are going to get into, really discusses how do we apply AI into this, and how the change of an organization and the way that they go to market, or how they just make decisions about anything is going to impact this, since today, we have so much more data and we have so much more information, so much more data, and we have more complex decisions and fewer, less time to be able to make that happen.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, a few years ago, when I was still at IDC, actually, so I guess that was more than a few years, but I got drawn into this and was advising a startup that really started to apply a structured process to the decision making in a company, and built a system that would kind of support that. Now, it was kind of it was definitely way pre-Gen AI, but it was pre-using AI in that as well. So, I could I got really interested because of the idea of structured process around decisioning. I think is something that a lot of companies just simply don't think about, and yet it is extremely important, I think. So I'm curious then, how does decision intelligence kind of come together with the traditional data analysis and then kind of squishing AI and machine learning into that mix.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So I started in decision intelligence when I was working on a project to win some money for college. So it was a contest, back in high school, and it was about traffic optimization, right? So one of the biggest problems has been that there wasn't a lot of data that I had access to as a high school kid, right? And so being able to, so I had to make up my own thing. And of course, when AI came out, the second time, this last time, not this time today with the Gen AI and certainly other but like during the machine learning phase, there was an absence of data sets. And so beforehand, people really couldn't use AI in that particular manner. So, but today, fast forward today, the reason, fast forwarding, and then I'll get back to today is, I started off in the energy space and there was a plentiful amount of, internalized data. There wasn't necessarily public data, but it was interesting. And it was really kind of what caught my eye on why decision support mattered, right? You can use it for planning, short-term planning, long-term planning. Then I applied that into the financial markets because it was a better, microcosm of human behavior since I was obsessed with that. And of course, the reason I even got into marketing and marketing technology was clearly it was going to be, overtake anything as a result of that data set. But to answer the question, really, the traditional data models and analysis still apply, but I think we start to really structure how we determine how we make decisions and then create a framework and a blueprint around that. And then we start to apply the data components to measure and understand why that's the case. So I hate the term data driven. I am not a fan of that because part of that reason is that it assumes that, people are taken out of the loop. And I think that's also been the fear with AI is that people are taken out of the loop. Sure, certainly simple tasks and simple decisions that are very predictable and have, very narrow variability. That certainly makes sense for using AI, and people who do that probably should be a little concerned. But complex decision making, particularly like acquisitions or roadmap decisions, maybe even manufacturing decisions, go-to-market decisions, financial, related matters, the healthcare. I think we were just kind of talking about that beforehand. These are all complex decisions that require some level of assistance, in addition to, the current decision-making paradigms. I've been told that yes, you can train for this, and why do we need AI and data for this? But because we're having to make faster and faster decisions, and more of them, and they're more complicated because there are more variables at play, we really do need some level of support and combining the disciplines of the decision-making, structure and feedback, as well as the data and the insights and research that is conducted is required and necessary. And that's why I'm excited about decision intelligence, because it truly is one of the definitions of where AI can help, and it's not trying to replace people. It's very clear, decision intelligence is about helping people accelerate or, formalize their decision-making process so they can make better decisions, increase their judgment over time.
Yeah, I've seen some pretty good examples lately, and I've been talking to a few startups about this that have sort of gone to the place of how do we make a lot of this unstructured data, because obviously we have tons of data in the business today, but a lot of it is very difficult to make actionable because it's a big blob, basically, right? It's hard to get to the usable parts of it. So I'm just curious, like, do you have some good examples that you've seen of how decision intelligence is being applied in different industries? I mean, we mentioned healthcare for one, but and how is it transforming decision making based on having this systematic approach?
Yeah, no, that's also fantastic. I think so. I'll give you 3 examples that I have that I've personally been involved with, but also there's use cases out there. I think if you look up decision intelligence and use cases, you'll see all kinds of varying, examples from, relatively automated types of things that can be decisions that are done that traditionally can be done, and all the way up to major complex policy making decisions. You mean even at societal level kind of things. One is since we talked about healthcare, there's a healthcare startup I've been working with. And they're using AI to try to reduce the number of reduce the nurses turnover. So, right now that is such a huge problem for hospitals in order to try to keep staff and faculty, staff and the nurses and the doctors, kind of operating under this very critical and challenging environment that they are in. But one of the key factors is nurse turnover. I mean, there are traveling nurses, right? And they make a ton of money, but keeping them on the same system is one of the most challenging things. So using what this gentleman's done and his team is they've really been able to build ways for companies to take there are consultancies who can help hospitals do that, but that can take months, if not into another year, in order to find some value in that. And so what he's been able to do is he's been able to harness a lot of that with AI. And now you've got an expedited way of being able to determine which nurses are unhappy for certain reasons that could be taken care of early. So apparently it takes 6 months before some problems that are becoming critical before anyone else can actually take advantage of that. So the decision intelligence comes in to accelerate that process. Not only do the hospital administration can determine why they're making the decisions they're making, but they can also evaluate based on this feedback through this platform and gathering that intel about, and certainly talking to our nurses and doctors and patients, incorporating all of those variable decisions about how they make policies about hospital patient experiences, in terms of recruiting, in terms of hiring. So that's really that's been able to reduce some hospital systems turnover by 50%, and that translates into reduced costs on the hospital side. I mean, the recruiting, onboarding, offboarding, insurance, right? Patient experiences increase, insurance costs go down for them, the liability insurance goes down. So that typically, that usually has been something that could be almost like a $10 million impact right away just to have something in there. But the patient experiences in a couple of instances has been improved by 40%. So and the reason that has happened is not because they've applied AI and, now they've got some, feedback loop mechanism, but it's the way they've been changing how they're making decisions about future policies and the future, procedures on how they're doing things. They're even making decisions now about which acquisitions they're making as a hospital system in terms of what makes sense and what what needs are there. Another example is I was working with a sports apparel company, and the decision making that they were challenged with was Roadmap One. And so this was more of a pilot kind of project that turned into how do we determine, with all the resources they have, right, all the capabilities they have, the dynamics of the market, and of course the individual brand, how do they turn around and determine what kind of product should they be building next? And they have a lot of IP, of course, and then of course there's a lot of talk in the marketplace, competitive intelligence. Typically, that's taken most consulting companies about 10 to 12 months to really make that determination about strategically which way they should go. Right. Now, in today's world, 10 months is way too long to make a determination. And of course, if you're a public company, which this was, you're operating on a 2-3 month kind of time frame and making sure that whatever you're doing has changed. So what we were doing is basically taking those particular pillars, and this just so happened to be the platform that I built from my last acquisition. It took those sort of the marketplace intelligence, combined that with customer information, the customer experience, customer engagement information. So that's sort of the brand meets the customer in the marketplace, and then the internal capabilities of the company, and then helped the organization determine some of the choices. But the key factor is that the executives had to be retrained on how to take that information and how to be able to make decisions, and that's where decision intelligence really also came into play. Our platform really helped accelerate that, maybe formalize that, and certainly made sure that they could see options or contingencies they had never considered. But it was still helping executives understand how to make those decisions, how to understand how to develop the discipline on and refining those decisions so that collectively they are not only just on the same page all the time, but more of how are they finding these new opportunities, and then certainly exposing more blind spots that they're going into. So this really turned into like we found, like, apparently they had found a $90 million new revenue stream out of this particular pilot project. So yay, successful.
Wow.
But that was a nice exception, but it was interesting that they were bringing lots of complex variables into play, and executives have to do this intuitively, count a lot of people, lots of biases. This methodical way was a means of these executives to own that entire process. They didn't have to really necessarily outsource all of that or count on an external factor, because at some point you own your own brand. And then the third example, to brag about myself, I mean, I've been using decision intelligence as a means to understand how to invest in future companies, right? Companies that are going to be successful in the future. And so part of the reason I got into the marketing tech arena was, as we talked about earlier, it was about so much information about people and behaviors and influences. It's all fascinating. And at that time, this was around 2008, 2009, when I started into a lot of this. That was also the arena when we were transitioning into the digital customer, right? So commerce was done online, business was done online. When I got into that space, and it was also when startups started to go crazy. There was a lot of funding going into them. SaaS was becoming a new business model. And because of the nature of the information that was available, was able to use decision intelligence to determine which companies to invest in, or at least were better likely to invest in, as well as the ones that were not to invest in, which was equally as important. And so that's where because of my obsession, even though I really didn't get into startups just to be an entrepreneur, it was an opportunity to really understand the future of how people are building businesses and how they're doing it rapidly. But there is a cadence and a series of variables that do come into play. And a lot of people are trying to solve this problem, of course. But I try to keep my decision making within a narrow paradigm, which is this. That's why my investors kept calling me, and I got the moniker Midas and Martech, because I was so obsessed with using that as a lens into investing both in public and private companies, not always just in marketing, but in a lot of different areas. And that turned into, $1 billion in returns. And more importantly, there was about a quarter of a billion that we did not invest in, that would have normal decision making would have invested in. And so we've avoiding bullets, and certainly finding new opportunities were some examples that really make me appreciate like what we're about to get into even more so.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned product in there, and as one of the examples, and I've talked to a couple of companies recently that are really focusing around product management and helping companies, sift through all the unstructured data that they have, and especially now with all of the recording tools that you use for your Zoom calls, sales calls, and whatever. So you have all of this voice data that could be really interesting if you could figure out a way to get to the actual useful bits of the data that are in there. So I think that's a really interesting area. And in fact, after I talked to like I said, a couple of startups about this, I decided, and so next week the guest is going to be somebody from that area, and we're going to dig into more around product management. But I think that's a particularly interesting one because of the importance, especially in tech. You got to get to market. You got to get to market with an MVP quickly. You got to iterate on it. You've got to incorporate user feedback. All those things sound good, but doing them is considerably harder than thinking and talking about doing it, right?
No, I mean, I'm sure it's serving as an analyst and working with G2. I mean, you've seen so many companies, navigate through their life cycles, and then not only imprinting, they could be great companies, but then the market is just brutal, or becomes either a headwind or tailwind for them. I completely agree. I mean, you probably seen like a lot of companies who have a lot of data but just can't extract a lot out of it, right? And I think that's the example you're getting into. It's a huge problem. I think people realize that, and maybe this leads into something in the future here, but everybody thinks that having a lot of data is the competitive advantage. It's not the amount of data that you have. It's really how you can leverage that and understand that. And I know it sounds cliche, but I think a lot of organizations had a lot of data. And I think this is where AI does help, is to harvest, what makes sense. And it doesn't all have to be structured. It doesn't all have to be clean now. And then being able to understand how those decisions are made and how the AI is trained and how the models work gives you a substantial advantage. So you're just dumping data into a place and then being able to move forward. But how have you seen, like, I'm going to turn on you just a little bit. I mean, how have you seen like some successful companies leverage tons and tons of information for actionable decisions that they're trying to make? I mean, what have you seen that have been
I mean, it is overwhelming, right? And I think that's, I used to, when I was at IDC, I came out, I was the contrarian who kept going, let's stop using big data because I don't understand it, right? Because it's what? It's two things. It's big and it's data. I don't know what else it does for me, right? So, we used to start to talk about this. How do you transform it to smart data and and small data, right? So how do you add context and relevance around a data set so that you could then apply it to something, whatever the something might be? And I think that's where, at G2, working with vendors, trying to take all that user feedback that we had, tons of it, and make it actionable. I had analysts that would take that data and then transform it into something that was, through different query tools, through some AI and some data science tricks, try to turn that into something that could be made into an actionable, relevant, contextual document that that help them improve themselves. So I mean, to me, that's the real trick, is how do I transform that with some specific context? And as we know now, and as we talk about Gen AI, context is everything, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
that drives how the outputs and outcomes are going to be. And I think that's what I've seen from the other side of it too, is how do you take that big lump of something and dice it in a way that makes it smart and makes it small so that you can apply it.
I'll double down on what you mentioned about context. I mean, I think that is what's made most companies successful leveraging data, right? They understand, they narrow the scope of what they're looking for. There is an outcome that they're looking to, an actionable outcome or an actionable decision that they're trying to make, and then they're targeting information. And part of decision intelligence, is why I'm excited about it, is really understanding whether you have enough data to make that decision. And if you don't, it's okay, but at least you're aware that there is an absence of that. But you can't know that if you're swimming in data, you're overwhelmed by swimming in data, and you're looking from from being in the pool upwards into the sky, right? I mean, it's a very different point of view. And I think it's going to be very shocking, but also really refreshing, because you're not swimming in the data, and you're not just lost in numbers. It's something meaningful that you're trying to extract, like raw materials for something that you're trying to build.
Well, so this sort of leads me into the next area I wanted to go into, and that's this idea around challenges that organizations might face. So how do they, this is a big change for a lot of companies, thinking about structured processes around complex decisions. So how do you help companies adopt decision intelligence, and how can these challenges, like adding context, like making it relevant, how can those be overcome?
Yeah, one of the first things with decision intelligence is, whatever term you're going to use and associate it with, because I'm sure we're going to see 15 different terms. It's a $15 billion business right now. It should be, I think, various analyst firms are saying that's going to be a $50 billion thing. I think most of them have been on track lately, so I think they've got a lot of the analysts are doing well this time around. Since the business is growing, one of the biggest challenges will be to say, listen, you can't measure success based on the quality of a decision based on the outcome, because there's so much randomness, there's so many other information that may not be available, and you're working with the information that you have, the best that you have. So as a matter of fact, there's a gentleman, and I encourage everybody to kind of check this out. There's a memo from a gentleman named Howard Marks. So he's with Oak Tree Capital. I had the pleasure of meeting him, and hopefully we'll get a chance to meet him again. But Oak Tree is famously known for, or at least Mr. Marks is famously known for his memos that he sends to his investors. And apparently Warren Buffett spoke highly of it and talk about like the best sort of endorsement there. And so everybody was obsessed with his memos. But there's one called You Bet. And he also mentions, he mentions two people, one on making decisions. One wrote a book about making decisions without all the information, right? And it was in the oil and gas industry. Another is Annie Duke. And if you're familiar with poker, you probably know who Annie Duke is. And the outcome of that was he succinctly talked about the fact that, lots of times you just don't have all the information, but the fact that you have a process in making the decision Your team is aware and not necessarily always on the same page, but aware of how that decision-making process is done, and you constantly refine it, your judgment continues to improve. And I think this is one of the hardest, and I'm spending a lot of time on this because I think this is going to be one of the hardest things for people to break from, is just because you're not making successful outcomes doesn't mean that your decision wasn't sound. Yeah. And it is a very, it can be a very ambiguous thing, but it doesn't have to be. And that's where decision intelligence comes into play. So, a lot of people think that decision intelligence is going to be programmatic. However, there are elements that represent that. But think of decision intelligence instead as like a coach or a mentor, or a collective consciousness, right? That's constantly being refined. So this idea of culture is going to be very useful, right? And how you lead and your leadership style will be very useful, and how decisions are being made as a result of it. So that success, the quality of your decisions can't be solely based on outcomes. Like, just remember that. I think that's one of the biggest things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say that makes sense. I mean, and that's feedback too, right? So the more you take the outcome and then you put it back into your models, the more you can improve over time.
Right. Yeah. It's the same it's sort of the same theme of, the smarter you get, the less you say. So typically that is something. So I must not be very smart, but what ends up happening is as you refine your decision making, you're not as whiplashed in terms of your decision-making paradigm and how you're actually making the company go from one thing to the next. You're confident in your decision, you go forth, and then you have to recognize when you need to either stop or continue forward and double down. And startup founders actually have a lot of, the good ones tend to have this built in, as well as many transformative leaders that are in the public arena. But the next one, we kind of alluded to it, which is, stop thinking about data driven, right? This is the perfect, arena where data enablement, right? The idea that you're leveraging data within a context to help you understand how to make a decision is incredibly important. Because those simpler tasks can be automated, but even the more tactical and then obviously into strategic decisions requires imagination and an executive function. And you are eventually, what we used to teach our executives who were using our platform, this go-to-market decision intelligence, was you're still steering the ship. This is not a replacement for you. Right. This is something that you are going to make a decision, even if it looks optimal out of the decisions that you're making, or the choices that you're making and the systems that you put in place gives you optimal choices. You still have to determine whether that's really what's best for the company. Right. I mean, I think Skynet said, if someone's programmed Skynet to ensure peace in the world, well, that was not the best ideal situation.
You probably should define how you get to peace a bit more, but
so having a little bit of a hand on the wheel is always going to be the case.
No, that human in the loop, I think, is an interesting one. But the other thing you hinted at in there too that I think is interesting, because we're not. When you talk about decision intelligence, you're not talking about a tool that gets everybody to a consensus ending.
That's right.
Right. So there's still a process, and often in a process in business, there's a decision maker, or at least a small group of decision makers. And conflict is not bad, but then knowing when it's time for that decision to be made and then move forward and refine things, that's a part. Timing is a part of that process as well.
Yeah, I think you hit on something as well. Like, I think it's one of the things that comes out of decision intelligence is everyone kind of separates themselves from the actual decision being made and the biases, and talk about the process of making that decision. And then, of course, using AI and data to accelerate and enhance those capabilities, but the conversation gets better, right? It's more refined about when it creates milestones that you're navigating through to get you closer and closer to a decision. So even if there is incredible conflict, at least you're hitting on points that you can narrow down to, as opposed to name calling in a boardroom, right? And I think that's incredibly important to move that decision along. The worst decision is indecision, right? So it's it's one of those things that I think would be incredible. And this kind of talks about the other thing where agility and the agility is going to be a challenge for a lot of people as well. We're making so many more decisions. How are you confident in this process, especially early on? Like, think about if you're thinking about running a 5K, but you're a couch potato, it's going to hurt early on. Like everything else, it's going to hurt. But I want to, assure everybody that this practice does get easier and faster, and it's not just a promise. This is something that's built into you and the people that you work with, and that translates into the systems that you're building. So a lot of times we think of the systems first, and then it's supposed to change the way we do things. Decision intelligence is the flipped way around of things. And of course, it goes with what I always say, which is technology only magnifies the people behind them, right? And so if the people aren't doing the right things, guess what? Technology is only going to magnify that. Same with this particular discipline as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, in that, one of the things that we talk about a lot in AI is bias and ethical concerns, right? And I haven't really thought about this as much in this context, but I'm curious what you think about this. So how does decision intelligence compensate or address the issues around bias and ethics and get to some way to ensure you get a fair and responsible outcome?
This one is probably the hardest question, but it's a great question that everybody's going to go through. And I'm still studying this myself as well. Is the first level is kind of what we alluded to earlier, right? You're kind of disconnecting from at least when you start decision intelligence and applying that in your organization or amongst your leadership teams. You're disconnecting from an actual decision, and you're talking about the process. So it brings out the natural biases about an outcome that you're looking for and says, let's try to, create a blueprint for the way that we're going to make decisions. So it's a layer, right? It's not exactly going to eliminate a lot of biases, but it also, the process of building a decision intelligence process or platform or capabilities within an organization, technologically enabled or not, it also forces you to consider the data that you don't know about. Right, the information you may not have, which naturally requires you to start thinking about other voices, other people that need to, need to be brought in. I've seen the best leaders who navigate decisions for an organization, especially large ones. They recognize that not everyone's going to speak up in a particular room. Right, everyone gives feedback in a certain way, and then even for those people who have feedback, they get very verbose, or they just kind of get off track. So the best leaders say, there's the whole sense of culture, but let's get a little more specific about this, right? The one part is the decision that you're trying to ensure different ways that someone can provide feedback to that process, right? So that's already building in, if you don't already have the culture of having a leader share with its teams that, hey, listen, you don't have to, you could be one of those people that listens to all the conversation and then provide your feedback, which sometimes in a meeting, it's too late by the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But it's very important. And just because you're not in a meeting doesn't mean you shouldn't share your ideals or share your thoughts or perspectives. So there's a frame, there's frameworks to building, there's tactics and frameworks for that. And then there is within a meeting, reinforcing what you want in terms how you want that feedback to be given is important, right? So listen, we'll give it, I think the Robert Rules of Order kind of gives you a sense of, for those who are verbose, you got 30 seconds, right? And what we are rewarding in terms of how we're being heard is, tell me, what you're trying to explain, what are you trying to, want us to, what's your point? Where are you getting that information? And then maybe something along the lines of, do you have a data point, like some outside objective data point? And then if everyone's bringing that to the table, they can have their own flavor of how they're bringing that to the conversation, but at least everyone's on the same page about what the expectations are about how to give feedback on the decision making. So if you have that built into a decision intelligence capability, then you can start to really see the change in conversations on decisions themselves. And as well as we talked about earlier, you can move the milestone down. It's not always going to be that pretty. You're going to have to go 2 steps back, 1 step forward, or the other way around. 1 step back, 2 steps forward sometimes. And then sometimes it's the other way, sure. But at least everyone knows where the decision is and the process of things. And I think that certainly pushes things around. But then also the uncertainty factor, because that is part of the decision-making process, evaluation is understanding what information you don't know. And then either you're going to be comfortable with it or you're going to try to bring people into it. So I think that also eliminates or at least reduces the number of biases that that are coming into play, that structure and that transparency that everyone is on the same page with. But how have you? What have you seen? Because I'm learning from everybody else, and I know.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think. I mean, one of the things that I thought was interesting you put this in. I think this is a really important factor in this whole idea is two words: transparent and consistent. Mm-hmm. So if you are transparent in the way decisions are made, that's a big step in a lot of companies, right? Because a lot of times it's like, there's no process to it. You just take this to Joe and Joe makes the decision. I don't know, right? Ask him the question, give him some data, whatever. Right. But, and then the other thing is consistency. So once you've established a process, then execute that fairly consistently. Right. There are things that will change inside of that, right? Because each decision's unique, and whether it's a product decision or a decision to buy another software tool, I mean, that's a completely different outcome. But process-wise and consistency-wise, you still want to try to execute that in that same way.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree.
Makes sense.
It's going to be interesting, and to see this played out. I don't know if you've seen it played out in terms of this. It's rough the first couple of meetings. I mean, it truly is, and I think everyone has to kind of accept the fact that it's a little messy. Yeah. But it doesn't hurt to have some help once in a while.
No, it doesn't.
Making sure that's the case. So.
And I think too that people over time you start to understand each person's style and the way they're going to try to insert themselves in this and help. Exactly. And and I think there's also this kind of transformation of this person has traditionally managed to manipulate or influence a decision. When the process is transparent, that's a harder thing for a single person to do, because we all sort of understand what we're going through to get to this end state that we think is important, right?
Right, exactly.
So I'm curious, though, we talk a lot about this, and we've, and there are definitely tools that are coming along to help with this process. Yeah. But what do you think? Pull out your crystal ball for a minute. Like, what do you think is happening here? Where do you think decision intelligence is going to go over the next few years? But both, from a cultural process way, but also from a technology support perspective.
Yeah, crystal ball. I try not to predict too far in advance, but at the same time, the thing that I'm excited about is just the behavioral changes of an organization. That's one part. And I think we've exhausted, a number of the reasons that that's the case. So I won't go into that a little bit. I also am happy and excited that this will bring about pulling the right data out, right? We talked about the contextual component. So a lot of these platforms that are being built, these tools, how are they harvesting the right information? Sure, you can integrate everything you want, but how do you know what's the right thing? And then what confidence level is that assessment being made on? So one of the algorithms I built this, for the lack of a better word, high frequency trading, algorithm based on sentiment analysis and commodities trading. And it's very sensitive to the news. If anybody's watched Trading Places, how news can really impact like that type of world. And one of the things that came out of that I really, failed to understand was that, having the larger context of what's going on, but then taking a narrower approach. I actually took a very narrow approach about how to, predict where, or how we should be making trades, but I failed to really understand how that was how the larger impact of the market was impacting the platform and the algorithms and the AI. So I think, really being able to understand both gathering the right information for that particular decision, but then also encouraging contingency and resiliency planning. So that requires greater context that's brought in to simulate how is that decision being played out. I think that's the future of what used to be actually decision support and how they did that now being able to do that in a fraction of the time, and then being able to change the organization. Now that if everyone's going to be AI powered, you're talking about a lot more decisions being made by one person or an individual. I'm sure there's going to be a metric on, utilization of, decisions per person.
Yeah, exactly.
And, that'll be some sort of like investment thesis that will, go crazy for some reason. But because of that reason, you've got high performing individuals who are making very vast decisions very quickly. You can't stay on top of that as a leader. How do you make sure that you've narrowed down the decision within that context to make that happen? That's one part. But the other part I'm also very excited about, and this is already happening with generative, is the idea that having, and of course it's getting played out, that having the same data everybody else has is not unique, right? I mean, that is not the competitive advantage. And that goes back to what Michael, you and I have been talking about the whole time, which is, having too much data and swimming in the data doesn't mean that you're, wealthy, right? You're just in the mud. And instead, the idea of being able to, leverage the data you are producing and coupling that with what's going on externally, I think is a commentary and a narrative on how do you make decisions that are unique to your organization. And particularly, you were mentioning this, right, from a product management standpoint.
Yeah.
Your customers better than anybody else out there. Your in brand and how valuable it is better than most, say, agencies out there. Not to say that they're not valuable. It's just more of that. There's so much internal information that people are learning. This new generation of the workforce and the traditional generation of the workforce are adapting to, are relying on their own data because it provides them with a real competitive advantage. It is a true asset, and I'm appreciating that. Being able to bring that mindset is changing. So it's almost more the people than the technology that I'm really excited about, especially in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always excited about this idea of the change in the business itself and the structure. I guess the one technology thing that I've been watching a bit, and it's still early, but is this idea around digital twinning and synthetic customer, synthetic data, synthetic whatever, so that you could actually have some technologies that would let you test some assumptions in an environment that's safe yet mirrors your real world reality, whatever that might be. So
I'll put since you mentioned the crystal ball, I think you and I can throw out a word: simulation, right? Like simulators will be the next, and even for decisions, right? How do you simulate the when you make a decision, simulate how that plays out? And then how does that work out, right? So we're going to hear Monte Carlos and rolls, and we're going to hear simulations, and then for everybody watching or listening in, right? I think Michael and I are chuckling because we've heard all this before, right? It's fortunately going to be more more mainstream, and I think that's going to be very positive for business outcomes in the future.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. As you know, I'm into this topic a lot, so I could certainly keep going. But before I let you go, one of the things I like to ask at the end, and you already actually sort of fulfilled this by recommending somebody earlier, but I'll hit you again. Is there somebody, an author, a thought leader, somebody that influenced your career that you think would be really useful for the audience to follow and learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I did mention Howard Marks, but he is a lot more on the investment side than the decision and investment side. But he is very thoughtful about how he thinks about the future and how it relates to the way they should invest. But I think you'll see that in a lot of people. One of the people that I actually more recently have found time and kind of introduced me or reintroduced me to the word decision intelligence. I always get into these, you and I probably get into these areas where there's not actually a phrase, but we know something's there, and all of a sudden someone coins a word and we're like, that actually works. Last time it was marketing technology, and then now it's like decision intelligence. But is Dr. Lorian Pratt? She has actually written a couple of books, but she has been, certainly a forethought contributor to the idea of decision intelligence, particularly on the building a framework side. I mean, she's aware that the AI and data are going to play their part, but really the idea of changing the organization and the way they make very complex decisions. So just keep that in mind as well, like large, big, complex, hairy problem decisions. She has been spending a lot of time and research on that, and I admire her work. She's actually included some of our, some of my and our, kind of outcomes and lessons that we've seen in a couple of her books. One's called Link, and then the other one is, it eludes me, but we'll put it in there later. Maybe you can cut this part out, but and then the other person is Cassie from Google. She's the chief scientist. She's the chief scientist in decision analysis. I've forgotten her last name. It starts with a K. And I haven't followed her recently because she's kind of stepped away from decision intelligence for a little bit. It's focused on some other, obviously priorities within Google. But she has been very prolific before she was in Google on the ideas of advanced decision making. And her, context, speaking of context, she brings a lot of wisdom and research and background into, more rapid decision making. So we're talking about sort of the more tactical to strategic capabilities, right? And I think she was hired at Google, in my opinion, is to really build in a lot more, not only decision making at the organizational level, but also how do they incorporate that into the algorithm? But yeah, those are a couple of people that are now starting to influence a lot of my decision making. As I look at people, I actually do just spend time following leaders who seemingly, it's not the most visible leaders, I would say. It's the ones that have consistently been successful. Right. So if you're looking at startup founders and want to admire them, go with the ones that have, exited 2 or 3 times. Right. And then focus on why what they're doing. They do this. There must be something that they're building, and it's not just their network of people that's incredibly powerful. And the other side, if you are on the investment side, I would look at investors in the public markets more than the private markets, and how they can take a lot of that information and assimilate that in trying to make very unpredictable decisions, especially nowadays. I'm happy to share later on, some people follow at that stage. But those are just a handful. But there's going to be some incredible people coming out who probably didn't realize they're great at decision intelligence and are going to come into the forefront of that as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you joining me today. Thanks so much.
Oh, Michael, this is a joy. And hopefully we'll have the chance to do this again. But I'm looking forward to what the future brings with decision intelligence.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining. Remember to hit that subscribe button. And for more on AI and other software research reports and posts, check out the arionresearch.com/blog and /research reports. And don't forget to join us next week. I'm Michael Fawcett, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.